Hello, it's me Seb, and here is the long-awaited, much postponed Greek myth retelling wrap-up. Greek myth month retelling wrap-up? Oh, that's got a kind of nice alliteration thing going on. But yeah, what happened? Well, I'll tell you what happened. First of all, I need to explain. Well, I can explain like the most important thing, which is what is this false advertising? Why does the thumbnail show a picture which does not match my surroundings whatsoever? Well, what happened was I was sat down to film this with my nice stack of books already. I took some thumbnail photos with them, and then as I sat down and inhaled to start speaking about the books, I just brushed the glass of water with my hand, and the computer is dead, murdered, or manslaughtered technically, I guess, but it's gone. It was an old computer, so I was kind of lucky in that way. It was on its last legs, and I didn't lose any data, so that's a blessing. But yeah, I needed to get a new computer, and like lots of things had to happen, and that took a while. So yeah, it's a month later. I'm visiting London, so this is why everything looks a bit different. But I am finally here to tell you about all the Greek myth things that I read, and they weren't just novels. It was sort of like there was some poetry, there was some plays, there were just some like scraps and bits and bobs. So like I decided to include all of that good stuff because it all makes up part of the tapestry of Greek myths that I was immersed in for the month of May. So this is the May reading wrap up, and let's go. Yeah, the order in which I'm going to present my readings to you is the same way that I did it last year, which is not in the order I read them, but in the order in which they take place in the mythological timeline, the Greek mythology sort of chronology. There's some cases where a book like kind of spans over like a long section of the chronology. So in that case, what I did was I just took the main myth that was being retold or explored and used that as the guideline to where to put it in this list. So for example, Circe by Madeline Miller kind of encompasses the whole of the Greek myths, like in terms of like the time frame, like from the early stuff, she talks a lot about the Titans and stuff like that, to at the end she talks about like after the Trojan War and so on. So the way I decided where to put that was I just used the actual like main myth of Circe, that's the basis of that, which is from the Odyssey. It's when Odysseus is coming home from the Trojan War, and he lands on this island and he meets a sea witch called Circe. So Circe is going to be way at the end of this list. And because I'm splitting this list into two different videos, if you want to hear me talk about Circe, then I'm afraid you're going to have to wait until the next video. Now, let's get on to the books. This first one actually doesn't really fall into the timeline after I gave you that whole spiel and everything, but this first one is Ferryman by Claire McFall. It's about a girl called Dylan who is in a train crash, and she dies in the train crash, and then she finds herself in this wasteland which looks just like the Scottish Highlands because that's where the train crashed, and she meets this boy called Tristan, and Tristan is no ordinary boy. He's her ferryman. He is going to guide her through the wasteland into the afterlife. So this is a YA fantasy romance novel. It's the first in the series. I've seen it marketed as a Greek myth retelling. It's not really retelling any particular story. Again, it's just this idea of the ferryman who takes you, like across a river into the next life, who guides you. And like that's not just a Greek mythology thing. That's like across like many, many cultures. And I looked up the word. I think I'd looked it up before because it looked familiar because it's just such a weird word. The word is actually psychopomp. I'll put it here on the screen. Psychopomp. That's what it is. The person who, when you die, guides your soul into the afterlife. And now the Greek mythology one, who's most famous, is I don't know how to pronounce the name. It's Charon, but I think based on like kind of the pronunciations of other Greek names in mythology, it wouldn't be like Charon or Charon. It would be like Charon. So make of that what you will. But the ancient Greeks believed that after you die, the last thing you do before getting to the afterlife is spending time on a boat with a Charon. So that's the only real connection with the Greek myths. And I have to say, there isn't even that much ferrying. It's sort of like a metaphorical ferrying. And I was very relieved when they finally get on a boat. And a little bit of the book is actually on a boat. Because I was getting kind of worried, like, why do they even call them the ferrymen? You know what I mean? If they just walk. And nothing against walking, it's just I felt like if you call it ferryman, you got to do some ferrying in your novel, okay? So one of the first things that I thought was really interesting about this book was the character of Tristan, because he's really arrogant and really mean to Dylan. And I just thought, oh wow, yeah, what if the person who guides you into, after you've died, supposed to help you across, is actually just like really mean? Another thing that I found really interesting about Tristan's character was, I mean, it's not really his character. It's like I was listening to this on audiobook, right? And it's a Scottish book, I think, but like, yeah, set in Scotland, and all the narration and the character of Dylan, it's all in a Scottish accent, and that was like a really pleasant surprise for me, because I happen to love the Scottish accent, and just listening to it I find quite soothing. But Tristan's character had an English accent. So for me it was like, kind of, wow, you've made the arrogant male figure of authority in this relationship like have an English voice, and the sort of like clueless dead Scottish girl who's being like kind of led along and doesn't know what's going on, and like is obviously the weaker person in the relationship, like have a Scottish accent. And it was like kind of this, just there's already loads of power dynamics in the gender stuff, but then adding that kind of colonial, well, what to me seems like a really obviously colonial element into it, or at least kind of regional tension. As far as I remember, it's not written anywhere in the actual text itself. So I was like, wow, it's rare that I think an audiobook narrator has the power to add like these kind of like strong nuances just by doing a different accent. And I thought, why did you do that? Why? It's like, if it's not in the text, why would you, like change a character's voice to suddenly like charge everything with this new nuance, which takes on all these sort of like political resonances. And I think like maybe it was kind of unconscious, because I feel like a lot of people just have like ideological like structures stuck in their heads, and like otherwise I have no explanation for why Tristan was inexplicably British. But anyway, that was something I found really interesting. So the colonial spin on things aside, the atmosphere I thought and the settings were really engaging, especially at the early parts, because we're walking through like just the Scottish moors or the sort of the heathland, and it's like, I don't know, it felt really atmospheric and like a very suitable land of the dead, or like in between limbo, like on your way to the land of the dead, which I thought fit the Greek mythology kind of idea of what the land of the dead is, which is just something quite flat and grey where not much happens, but like, yeah, like also like a bit rough and wild sometimes, with a kind of a threat to it, and a wildness to it, but in a sort of muted and subdued way. So anyway, I love the setting, and the fact that for a lot of it it's just them walking through like kind of over these hills and stuff like that. It felt kind of like an indie movie, like you can imagine like a very, very low budget indie movie about like a psychopomp leading a dead person, and like the relationship, what would the relationship be like between the psychopomp and the dead soul as they go across into the next world. And I love the premise. That premise and that setting and that atmosphere was fantastic, I thought. Unfortunately, I do think there were quite a lot of problems with this book. First of all, Dylan doesn't know she's dead for a lot of it, right? But we obviously do. I mean, the book is called Ferryman. Like, even if you hadn't read the blurb, you can kind of put two and two together after there's the train crash and she comes out and there's nobody there. The fact that she takes so long to get to that point where she knows that she's dead, and the fact that she's got this kind of fluttery romantic thing with him as well, even though she's supposed to have just been in a train crash and all the other people in the train have disappeared, and it's just like, it doesn't really make sense, or she's really stupid, you know what I mean? And like it would have been so much better if she just was on the same page as the reader, and knew she was dead like from very early on. I think that would have saved a lot of annoyance, on my part at least, from the get-go. And I think the fact that we know more than Dylan is also makes her character quite dull, because for most of the book we're stuck in her perspective of the world. So we're kind of seeing things through her eyes, but we always know more than her. And like that, I think is just like, it creates this gap which makes it hard to really like connect to the character, as well as the fact that she's quite flat as a character. And then like sometimes we jump into Tristan's head and we get like his thoughts, and he's supposed to be this sort of ancient being which has taken the form of a teenage boy to ferry her across. So you'd think he'd have some interesting things to think about. It's sort of like, she's not like other girls, it's just like kind of, wow, I've ferried so many people across the millennia from the world of the living to the world of the dead, but I've never met anyone quite like Dylan. And it's like, really? This girl is the one that you, what? I don't like, it's just so, it would be so much better if we just never got into Tristan's head and we were always like kind of wondering who he is and what he's really feeling. Does he even care about Dylan, or is this, you know, just like a job to him? And you know what I mean? But it's supposed to be a romance, so even though like that tension is kind of there from Dylan's perspective, I think the writer puts us in Tristan's head so that we know that he is actually kind of like not like devious and mean and horrible. He's actually kind of a nice guy. And yeah, of course, like he does turn out to be a nice guy because of the whole romance thing of the guy being like all mean and horrible to the woman, but then after a while she finds out that underneath that rough exterior he's actually got a kind and loving heart. And I don't know, I just find that whole thing pretty gross and it's not that fun to read. But it wasn't awful because the setup was so engaging, and the atmosphere was great. I could kind of forgive a lot of those other things. Usually I feel like in genre fiction, I can kind of guess and figure out like the basics once we have the setup. But in this one, it's like she's already dead and he's taking her to the afterlife, and then that's it, right? So like, what can happen? You know, what's going to happen when they finally get there? Is that going to be like they get there and that's the end of the book? Or is there going to be something else after she's passed on? And like, and the further we got into it, the more I felt like I had no idea where this story was going to go, but like, you know, in a really good way, because I was thinking like, what could possibly happen? If I hadn't had that kind of anticipation, I might have given up on it, to be honest. But like, the anticipation was strong. It was strong. I'm not the target audience for this, right? I'm not a teenager. I'm really not into romance normally. So my opinions, you know, you should take them with a pinch of salt. If you like YA and you like romance and you like fantasy, then maybe this is the book for you. But yeah, I don't regret reading it. Incidentally, my favorite psychopomp retelling story is a film called Afterlife, directed by Koreeda Hirokazu. And like the psychopomps are like kind of like office workers, and after you die you go to the office building. They help you decide on the most important memory of your whole life. Then they help you make a cinema like small film, low budget film of that important memory. Then you watch the film and then you pass on into the afterlife. So it's just such a random premise, but it's really moving. I really love it. Next up, Tales from Ovid by Ted Hughes, which I didn't I kind of had in my pile and I occasionally dipped into it, but I only really read like properly and thought about and like kind of, you know, invested properly into one poem in this, which was Niobe. I should explain, this is a book of poems, of poetry written in 1997 or published in 1997, which is based on the Metamorphosis by Ovid. So what Ted Hughes has done is he's like taken bits of the poem Metamorphosis and kind of like rewritten them in his own style, and I'm surprised how much it reads like a translation. It's obviously not a translation, but it's like it really feels very, very, very true to Ovid in lots of ways, while you know, also being very Ted Hughes. I really like Ted Hughes as a poet, and I absolutely love Ovid as a poet. So like, and I've known about this book for ages, so it's like two poets that I really admire, and like in one book, in the same poems, it's like kind of like, well, I don't know why it's taken me so long to get to this one. But yeah, I only read the Niobe, and Niobe is like such a great story, and that's where we kind of get into the chronology now of it, because that story takes place before any of the other stories that I'm going to talk about. Niobe is this Eastern queen who moves to the west to marry, and in Thebes, where Niobe is the queen, there's this cult of the goddess Leto. And everyone is just like, it's Leto fever, it's Leto season, everyone's going crazy for Leto, and Niobe doesn't like this. She just like storms out in the street. She's like, you don't even know if this god is real. She could just be some story or some myth that people have come up with. I'm real, I'm your queen, I'm right here. And like, she just starts comparing herself to the goddess, and the main thing that she keeps coming back to is that the goddess only has 2 children, whereas Niobe has 14 children. So how can she even be all that? I love Niobe's energy and her sass and her unapologetic pettiness when it comes to like taking on the gods, but also like her pride in being in her motherhood, no, and like her fertility as a woman, and like the idea that you can, you know, she takes the sort of the sexist ideas of that you can measure a woman by how many children she has, or how like good at child rearing a woman can be. And she just completely makes them her own. You know, she's like, I'm a fertile bitch. You know, like look at all these kids I've got. And so like it's just really fun. Then Leto hears about this. Leto gets really upset. She calls her two kids, and because she's a goddess, it's just so funny how upset she gets. She's like, this Niobe, she's so mean, and she said such horrible things about me, and you know, it's just, I'm having the worst time. She's suppressing my followers, and it's so horrible. And so like Apollo just like kind of cuts her off, and he's like, all right, mom, yeah, okay, we'll deal with it. The longer you go on, the more like time is spent with us not wreaking havoc on Thebes. So can we just, yeah. And Apollo and Artemis, her son and daughter, are both archers. They're famous for being gods of archery. And so they go, and Apollo takes down the 7 sons, and Artemis takes down the 7 daughters. I'm doing this like little flicky thing because like they just shoot them with the arrows, like boom, boom, boom. And that's a beautiful, like huge section of the poem is just the children being killed by arrows. And it's always like stuck with me. It stuck with me in Ovid, and I thought Ted Hughes did a really great job of like kind of recreating that like kind of theater of violence, and it's really like kind of quite horrific. And then at the end, Niobe is sad and turns to stone. And I don't know, like it's something about the way that the language is beautiful, the structuring of the narrative with this sort of like battle between two mothers, and then becoming this huge like gore fest, like you know, like 18 plus horror film with the murders, and then it kind of becoming this simple thing of just weeping, and she becomes a waterfall, and it's like kind of goes back to nature. And that structure and the beautiful language and everything, it's wonderful. It's such a good poem. Now, if you thought a poem from 1997 was old, then this one is from the 3rd century BC. It's Jason and the Argonauts, or the Argonautica, by Apollonius of Rhodes, who I found out when I read the little introduction thing was actually from Alexandria. They just called him Apollonius of Rhodes, so that's like confusing. Maybe it was like an in-joke with his friends or something. Who knows? I don't know. Jason and the Argonauts is not my favorite Greek myth by a long shot. The story of this sort of band of heroes who get on a boat and they go and they have to get the golden fleece from this Eastern kingdom. The thing is that I watched the movie, the Harryhausen movie, the Ray Harryhausen movie, I should say, when I was a kid. You know, like the stop motion monsters and stuff like that. And people always remember Clash of the Titans now because it was remade, and that was also really good. But I honestly think Jason and the Argonauts was the better of the two, and like it's just such a good, like kind of swords and sandals like kind of monster movie to watch as a kid, and like it's those images are like kind of imprinted on me, and it was maybe like an important step in my Greek myth obsession. I don't know, like it's quite early, maybe not, but anyway, I do have fond feelings towards this myth, let's say. And I've only read the first book of it so far, so I haven't read all of it. It's separated into 4 books, so I guess the first book is like the first quarter of it, so I've read the first quarter of it. But the first book has this like kind of beautiful like internal narrative as well. Jason gets all these heroes together, and they're going to go on the boat on the big adventure, and he says we should decide who the leader of the expedition is going to be to organize things better. So we should do a vote. And unanimously, everyone just like points at Hercules. They're just like, yep, Hercules, definitely. Hercules, no question about it. But Hercules is like, no, it shouldn't be me. It should be Jason. Come on, it's his adventure, it's his boat, it's his story. He gathered us. He should be the guy. But also, if you don't pick Jason, then I'm gonna beat the crap out of you. So this tension all the way through between like the crew and who's supposed to be the leader, and it's kind of underlying things. And at the end of the book, then that comes to a head, and Hercules ends up, you know, like mild spoilers for a like 2,300-year-old text. Hercules ends up like leaving the team, like getting kicked off the team basically. So and that like kind of leads to like a bit of a fight on the boat, and that's exciting. And it's exciting. There's monsters, there's fighting. It's like the sort of the fantasy journey. You know, the band of heroes traveling on an adventure. It's like it's that kind of thing. I wouldn't say the poetry is like in the high echelons of like wonderful poetry that I've read in my life, or at least this translation of it. But it's it's like I said, it's a really comforting kind of sort of like fantasy story to read before going to bed, and I'm definitely looking forward to finishing it at some point. Unlike the first 3, we now have a non-library book, which is just Jason. And this is the one that I actually thought maybe I shouldn't include on this list because I barely read any of it. But like I really this is, of all the books that I didn't like kind of finish like properly, this is the one that I wanted to like get to the most, because it's one that I found in the house in Ireland, published in the 60s, I think. It looks so trashy, this Jason. It looks like kind of like a pulp novel, and I read the first like the prologue, or I think like it wasn't the first chapter, it was like the prologue, so like a very short chapter, and I loved it. It's just like, it was actually really well written. I'm excited to see how they do the full thing in a novel format, instead of like a poem or a movie, which is the other ways that I've consumed the story now. So so I'm really excited to get to this one, and I'm definitely going to read it at some point. But it was so different from the other things that I read that I really wanted to include it here on this list. The next book also had a really great prologue, and that's Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. Also, like, before you even get to the prologue, what a cover! Like, it looks gorgeous by itself. If you don't know anything about Greek mythology, it just looks nice. And also, like, if you do know the myth, then there's all these allusions to it, like with the vines and stuff. So it's just a very well done cover, I think. Like, I find it very appealing. After the cover, we have a little quotation from Rhodes, which is the first book I read this year and which I absolutely raved about. So straight away it gets another thumbs up from me. So you're doing great. You got a great cover. You got a great little poem at the beginning, and then we get to the prologue. What a brilliant opening to a fantasy novel this is. So it's telling the myth of Nisus and Scylla. So that's already like it's contained. It's like a short myth all to itself. So that's already good. You get a little story, like an injection of adrenaline or something. It introduces Ariadne's voice, which is very intriguing, although it's just a narrator at that point. And the villain, Minos, who is sort of like cast as this sort of like Bluebeard fairy tale kind of character. At the same time as this sort of simple story that's told, we get this world building, because we understand that the story is of a war between Crete and Athens, and so we get the kind of idea of the political tension between these two city-states. And that's just in the background of the story. It's like really great subtle world building where you understand kind of the world through the story, right, rather than being told it. And you also get this great foreshadowing of father-daughter conflict, because the story is about a daughter who betrays her father. Scylla betrays Nisus. And the story is kind of like featuring heavily this villainous character, Minos. And then we find out that the narrator is the daughter of Minos. And that's Ariadne, right? So we see a betrayal being foreshadowed on the horizon, and that's like it's just done really well, and it's all in just over a page. I have a lot of respect for books that put loads of effort into creating a great hook at the beginning, and I really think that Ariadne succeeds on that level. I think it has some of those sort of formulaic things. There is actually the line, "I released a breath I had not realized I'd been holding." Like, I was shocked that actually appeared in it, because I thought that was just a joke at this point, but no, Ariadne at one point does release a breath that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. So, that might jar with some people. In the story of the Minotaur and the Labyrinth and stuff, Ariadne usually just falls in love with Theseus, right? The reasons that she falls in love with him are, not usually gone into. But Jennifer Saint really gives her such complex and strong motivations for suddenly, having this instant love for the prince, which I thought was done so well. So first of all, there's this sort of martyr feeling where she feels bad for Athens and these poor Athenian people who are getting murdered by her brother, the Minotaur, and so she wants to be able to sort of do something to help them and escape, and so she sees Theseus as a way out of that kind of struggle. And she wants to sort of throw herself on his side. Then there's just romantic sexual attraction, which is also there and also very present, but done in a not weird or creepy way, because she's quite a young girl, and I just thought it was handled very honestly, which was refreshing. Then there's her father, Minos, who's a tyrant and who's going to marry her away to this old man, or this horrible person. So marrying Theseus or running away with Theseus would be an escape from this other fate which has been put up for her by the patriarchy, right? So it's this sort of insta love at first sight, whatever, oh, I'm a princess falling for the prince, he'll rescue me. It's there, but it's done in such a well motivated way. I saw Goodreads reviews where a lot of people didn't get on with it because they just couldn't they didn't like Ariadne. I think was one of the biggest complaints, like the character of her, because like I mentioned, she's so passive, and she kind of like she's not a girl boss at all. She doesn't like she has these sort of feminist like aspirations, especially when she's young. She's sort of like, I'm not going to be one of those princesses who just gets rescued, you know. I'm not going to let the gods screw me over. I'm not going to let men screw me over, and so on. But by the end of it, she's had to like kind of reconcile herself to the patriarchy, and like kind of had to make choices within the kind of, you know, the framework that she lives in ancient times, just to get by. And those sort of compromises and sacrifices felt to me really like true. I feel like the complaint that the book isn't feminist enough because Ariadne is passive and often follows like quite conservative roles. I don't buy that at all personally. I felt it was really feminist, and I thought Ariadne was a fascinating character by the end. Right, like the beginning, she's intriguing. Then she becomes kind of flat and boring. Still, she's interesting because of the love story and because of Jennifer Saint, like using her as a canvas to talk about Greek myths. And then at the end, Ariadne becomes super interesting, I think, because she's matured as a character, and we kind of see her develop. And yeah, like I absolutely love this book. I think this book would be great if you're into the Greek myths and to see how Jennifer Saint does it. And it would be great if you've never read the story of the Minotaur. I think this would be a great introduction to the Greek myths for like young people as well. I really think that like young people would be the best audience for this book. And by young people, I don't mean like young like me. I mean like, you know, like young teens, right? Or maybe even younger as well. Although there is a bit of bestiality and, you know, some murder and stuff. But like, yeah. They can handle it, right? The kids are tough, they can handle it. Funnily enough, the one thing that really drew me to this book in the first place actually disappointed a bit in the end, although I liked it at the beginning, and that was Phaedra, because the myths of Ariadne and Phaedra are always, as far as I know, have always been told as two separate stories, right? Like completely not connected to each other, even though they're sisters. And I'm just really drawn to sibling relationships in Greek myth. Not just sibling relationships, kind of like lateral relationships, because like so much of Greek myth and mythology in general is about heritage, right? Like we come from these people who came from kings, who came from gods, and it's like kind of that like very vertical lines of like this person, son of that person, and like, oh, he's the hero, son of the god, and you know, it's like all about son of this and daughter of that. So I'm really interested in lateral connections, cousins, best friends, lover friends, lovers, and not lovers so much because, you know, that's done loves like romance. But yeah, siblings and cousins basically are super interesting for me. So Phaedra and Ariadne, I really enjoyed that. But by the end of it, Phaedra kind of faded, and she wasn't like I don't know. Her some bits of her journey were super interesting about like kind of. She after she has babies, she has what's it called, postpartum depression, and the way that she compares with Ariadne, we see their lives in parallel. That's really interesting. But she kind of just, I don't know, the actual myth of Phaedra is, I don't know, that bit didn't deliver for me personally, which is why it was good that the next book I read was the most famous retelling of Phaedra, I think, by Jean Racine. It's a play written in 1677. Basically, the story is Phaedra is married to Theseus. Theseus has a son. Yes, that same Theseus who, like, you know, had the Ariadne story, ends up marrying the other sister. And yeah, Theseus had a son by another woman, an Amazon. And the son is called Hippolytus. Phaedra falls in love with her stepson, and that causes all sorts of problems. In this one, they kind of make it interesting by having Theseus absent from the whole beginning of the play. So people are thinking, oh, maybe Theseus is dead, in which case there's a power vacuum. So who's going to be the next ruler? And like, it could be Hippolytus, or it could be Phaedra's sons, or it could be this other woman. What was her name? Alicia? I think it's Alicia. And she's another myth which is brought in, and that's really cool. So it's like kind of this. There's not really a power struggle, but like kind of a power struggle between these three. But they're not necessarily struggling against each other, because Alicia is in love with Hippolytus, and Hippolytus is in love with Alicia, but Phaedra is in love with Hippolytus. And so it's kind of murky about who actually wants to get the power in the end. and like maybe they want to get it for another person in the triangle, and then Theseus comes back and everything gets messed up. I really liked how it could feel like so passionate, and so political, and like marry those things together in such a like natural way that like when you read it you don't think about those two elements as separate. You know, it feels like kind of just one and the same. I don't have that much to say about this one. Like, it wasn't mind-blowing, it was a good read, and like specifically the way that passion and politics come together in this very messy love triangle, and yet it feels so smooth and natural, was, I thought, like really interesting and well done. So yeah, Phaedra. And then the final part of the whole Theseus, Ariadne, Phaedra cycle is this little pamphlet that I was so happy to find in the house in Ireland, because it's one of the huge things that got me into Greek mythology when I was a bit older. So when I was a kid, I was already kind of into Greek mythology, but you know, like in the way that lots of kids are, you just read the storybooks and they're kind of fun, and you know, you don't really know much about the stories, and then you kind of grow up and forget about them. But when I don't remember when, how old, what kind of teen I was, if I was 13 or if I was 17, but you know, teen time, I was staying in Ireland in the house where I'm living now, and I found this pamphlet that my grandfather would have gotten from a newspaper or something. This pamphlet of Greek myth retellings, all centered around the theme of love. And they had the Theseus and the Minotaur myth, or maybe I should be calling it the Ariadne myth now. But it's, it was done, it like completely shocked me. So I thought like, oh, this is kind of familiar, like when I was a kid, I know these stories, let's read these again. And then I read them and I was like, wait, she did what with that bull? And like, it just completely blew my mind that there was so much sex and violence in Greek mythology, which I hadn't really understood or known about or been told when I was younger, and that is sort of like quite integral to the myths as well, and to the gods, and like how they go about doing things. So the first thing that blew my mind was all the sex and death and like bestiality and stuff, and then the second thing, which really made me like quite intrigued, was the way that these stories were all interconnected and like following like a timeline, right? And that the way you tell a story is really up to the storyteller where you begin and where you end, because everything is interconnected and goes on for ages. So you could start with Ariadne and end with Icarus, for example, falling into the sea. Or you could start with Minos invading Athens and then end with Theseus returning home. And then it would be framed in a sort of more like male lineage kind of way. And like, you know, the way that you start and the way that you stop completely changes the stories, right? And you can do that in so many different ways, because, well, kind of infinite, because they're all like threaded together, and where you start and stop is totally up to you. And that's obviously what the other people that I've talked about in this video did as well. They liked the myth and they said, we're going to start at this part and end at that part, and that's how we're going to frame it. And that's why the retellings are so fun in general. So yeah, that was what I discovered when I read this kind of collection all about love. So I read it again, and it was really fun to reread, because obviously I have really good memories about this pamphlet. And it was such a like when I first read this, it was like a big step in me. It was a big step for me in becoming like really enamored with the Greek myths. It wasn't the main one. It was the one that made me appreciate them as an adult. But I only became like a properly obsessive nerd like in 2018 when I read Metamorphosis by Ovid. But that's another story. So that's it. That's the end of part 1. Join me next time when we will be doing the whole Trojan War cycle and what happened next, and sea witches and sea monsters and all that good stuff. Do drop me a line down in the comments, whether it's Greek myth related or just general reading book related things, then please be my guest. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much for watching, and see you in part 2. Bye bye.